What else are you teaching?
Just American too. Reconstruction to present. What was that?
Is that like 105 or something?
What, hey, was 9/11 an inside job?
No comment. You know, it's funny as a like a historian. Obviously, I don't think so, but as a like conspiracy theorist, man.
Do you think we landed on the moon?
That one, I absolutely believe in conspiracy theory. That it's complete bullshit that we were landed on the moon.
Really?
No, I'm joking.
I was gonna say, like,
Seriously, you guys are like, wait a minute, this is not the right guy to be taking class with.
I was totally gonna like petition for that like compassionate withdrawal.
I love a good conspiracy theory. Obviously, I mean they're really
Okay.
fun.
Two questions. Who killed Princess Diana?
I think it was a bad driver, frankly. I really don't think that was a conspiracy theory. You want to talk about Kennedy's murder, though? Yeah, I could probably get behind some of those conspiracy
Okay.
theories.
The problem is there's so many choices for Kennedy.
Second one is who killed John Benet Ramsey?
The brother.
The brother.
The brother.
And the parents never did it.
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, question.
Yeah.
No, and like this is like, how did someone else's DNA get in like her clothes?
I'm assuming they planted it. The parents seemed way. I mean, like I was young when John Benet was murdered, but I remember such a sensational thing when I was growing up. It always felt every time they interviewed the parents. I don't know why I'm saying this into the recording, but it always felt when they interviewed the parents that there was something super wrong, something weird about how they reacted to it. Obviously, it's not an area of expertise. Look
But
at me.
like, is
I have no expertise on this.
is there an appropriate way to react to your child's death?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. The vibe you shouldn't give off after your child dies is weird and creepy. I'll say that.
Okay, I mean, that's fair. I was just wondering.
Yeah. I that's right. Their vibes, not great.
So you have a theory on Kennedy?
I think there were shooters on the grassy knoll. That's what I think. Okay, that's not really true. I don't really sort of think that. I do think that it's deeply suspicious that the man who shot him is probably America's most well-known defector.
Oh, yeah.
And it's deeply strange on several levels once you read into, Oswald's biography.
Do you think he knew he was gonna die?
I mean, I think it was pretty much once he killed Kennedy, there was no way he was going to make it.
No, I mean, do you think Kennedy knew he was gonna
Oh, no, I don't
No.
think so. The Kennedys always think they're invincible. Just
Yeah.
check the one who's running for
I
office
have,
right
I have
now.
a story idea for the Kennedy assassination.
What do you got?
My story is, if you steal it, I don't care. My story is I'm gonna have I'm gonna have the mafia, I'm gonna have the Cubans,
Oh, yeah.
I'm gonna have the military industrial
Sure,
complex,
sure.
I'm gonna have Johnson.
If
All
you
these different groups are in Dallas they're fighting each other, and then the one goes and kills Kennedy. And you've got 4 groups there, all planning on killing him all that day, and they can't get out of their own way, and they're all fighting each other, and he winds up getting killed by a lone gunman.
Interesting. That's an interesting, I like that.
Okay.
Once you see that my book that's going to be published next week is based entirely on your story.
If you get it done, just an idea.
I like that. Yeah, that's right. I've already got, actually, since you said it, I already texted Netflix and I have rights for the movie,
Oh,
so
you already-
Netflix works very quickly, right?
These are my retirement plans.
Well, now they're my retirement plan, sorry.
I'm gonna get it before you will.
Oh, no. You know better. I don't want any damn Red Sox hats in my classroom.
You're gonna be like so disappointed in me at first. Like I glanced over and I was like, oh, now I said the Braves hat, and I was like, oh shit. Then he said Boston. I was like, yeah, you're right, it's Boston.
So I can wear my Army hat. I should wear my Army hat.
Army's fine. No, Boston.
My Yankees
Well, no,
hat.
he's
Yankees
asking
great.
Because if you like the Yankees, then you're probably like a commie or,
Okay.
Is there anything more American than apple pie and Yankees baseball?
No.
The answer is no,
I have a Yankees
obviously.
hat signed by Derek Jeter.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. If
I will
you
never wear that one to class.
your baseball bat,
I also have a A-Rod jersey signed by him as well.
that's a good thing. I'm a big A-Rod fan. After many years of his stupidity, I still love him.
Oh yeah.
Oh shit! I should probably turn on this projector.
And J-Lo. J-Lo's cool too.
I'm less fond of J Lo, but I'm okay with her. She's not my favorite artist.
I'm a fan of Joe.
I don't think anyone likes J-Lo's music though. They just like.
I like J Lo the person more than I like J Lo the music. But to be fair, neither of those are like things that if you asked me a trillion things I cared about, those things would not be on the list of a trillion things I actually care about. So.
I have the most bizarre reason for not liking J-Lo.
Why?
She traveled with an entourage, and that's what I heard one time. She has someone that's responsible for her toenails.
Ooh.
One person, that's their sole job, is to make sure her toenails look good.
Hey, you know what? If my job was J-Lo toenail cutter and I was getting 6 figures for that, I sure as shit would abandon you guys for J-Lo toe cutting. I think that's very fair.
Would she move up on that list then?
No shame when it comes to that. That's an easy call.
Well, hey.
I love you guys a lot. I love teaching, but if I was getting 6 figures to sit around an entourage bus and then clip toenails, you know I'd be gone.
Well, it's not just clothes, there's more involved. There's painting and there's
I'll learn.
the whole thing.
Do I get health benefits? I'll learn, man. I'm
Probably.
You tell her history shit while you're doing it.
Oh, absolutely. So J-Lo, today we're going to talk about the morning wars. Don't move your feet. Quit it, J-Lo. God, this is all going up on Black.
Today we're talking about how J-Lo participated in the
This
voting
is-
wars.
That's right.
This is the evidence I'm gonna use when I do my grievance.
Good luck. Alrighty. So where are we? Oh, did you guys get the announcement I sent out this morning?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
About the paper.
Yep, about the paper. Has anybody looked over it?
No.
I've
Not yet.
looked over it a little bit.
Okay, so it's your term paper. Obviously, you guys don't need to submit anything to me for about 2 weeks or so. I think the paper proposal is due on the 19th.
17.
17th, whatever it is. Yes, 17th of September. You guys have a couple of weeks. The proposal itself is nothing big. You need to have a topic idea, a thesis statement of some kind. That's about it. We're talking a couple sentences at
So
maximum.
the topic could be a certain battle or like how.
So the one thing you cannot do for this paper is a certain battle, because I know I mentioned that, but that's your project. That's separate. Your project is going to be over a certain battle. Your paper has to be something else. No certain battles. Talk a war. You could talk about, there's a zillion things. I'll let you guys get to it. If you have questions or you have concerns or you need help coming up with a topic, go ahead. You're certainly welcome to explore lots of different options. And after talking with John a little bit, I think I'm more than willing to spread the overall limits of the topics. John suggested something like 30 years work. I think I've changed my mind. If you want to do something as long as we talked about it in class, I'm pretty willing to be open to that. It's a 10-page paper minimum, so think about something that you want to write about, basically, and that you want to write about a lot. So conceptualize it big.
Pretty sure your syllabus says 8, so is it 10?
It's 10. Definitely says 10. I know it does. I double checked it today. It says 8 secondary sources. You need 8 secondary sources in the middle of it. Go read over that. We'll talk about more on Wednesday. I don't want to bog you down. You guys probably haven't seen much of it. So read over the syllabus. I sent it out. It's on Blackboard. Take a look at it. Check your email. We'll talk about it Wednesday. Sound good?
Do we have in-person classes on Friday?
Why wouldn't we?
Because of
Because of Derby.
the derby.
There's a derby?
Yeah.
Oh, it's Oaks on Friday.
Yeah. I was just curious.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if we work really hard today and Wednesday, we can just have a day off.
Well, it's not like it's not like you guys are going.
You can't go this year.
Yeah, so nice try.
No, I was just actually making sure if you were gonna I didn't want to shoot.
You don't have a good reputation for just asking normal questions. There are always a slant when you drop a question into this class. So
I used an honest question because in my other class.
here, I'll say this: we're actually running a little bit behind in this class, so I don't want to give up with Friday. But let me think about it because I wouldn't. We'll see. But you guys are off Mondays. No, nice try. No, you're here on. No, you get Monday off. Very well played. Come to think of it, but no. I'll see you on Friday. Labor Day. Labor Day. That was a very slick attempt at 4-day weekend. Very slick. Okay.
Good job, Greg.
Yeah, that was really well played.
Not good enough, Greg.
Close, but no cigar. I
How
would say.
many
I tried.
primary sources?
What was that?
How many primary sources?
I don't really care for primary resources in this paper. If you want to use them, that's fine, but it's a secondary. You guys are doing a 300 level class. If you don't want to use primary resources in your paper, that's quite all right. If you do, it's totally fine.
I love you.
I'm not requiring it.
Thank you.
I know, everybody does. It's a fatal failing.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much.
Okay.
Now I'm scared.
Are you gonna teach us anything today?
Would you, but you know what, this is why we never get anything done, is I got sarcastic comments from Boston, I got you trying to screw the weekend, I mean, this is why we never get anything done. All right, okay, everybody shut up and listen to me.
Don't mind me typing up the grievance.
I think you at least by this point told me you're gonna fill at least 12 to 15 grievances, so you know what, bog yourself down in the paperwork, I'll catch you in, 6 months. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. We have talked in this class now about the particulars of the Spanish conquest of the New World and the English settlement of the New World, yes?
Yes.
So let's talk about the last one that we need to get our head around, which is the French. New France, as the colonies of France will be called in the New World. We got Spain for flavor quite frequent, or quite clearly. We're talking about it as we got to its conquests. We talked about English settlement. We also now need to know French settlement because it's the fighting between English and French settlements that will eventually produce an American identity, which will eventually produce in the United States. America and France are inextricably linked for several reasons in this course. One, France and England's fights from basically the 1650s through the 1780s will be a major component of global conflict in this class. The United States, or at least some of its very earliest patriots, participate in the French and Indian War, which is a vital war for this class, one of our 5 big wars we're going to examine. Even more importantly, France will then intervene in the American Revolution and save the United States before it can even be destroyed by the British, and then far more important than that is the French Revolution, the birth of the Levy en masse, and then a little Corsican who takes over the world. All of which will be very vital in how we understand America, because there is no divorcing the United States from its French friend and sometimes enemy over the course of this class. So let's start with, so if you're looking on at home, Michael, the French connection is where we should be on a slide. What do you guys know about the French experiences in the New World? Do you know anything, something, everything? Nothing? What do you got?
They really like beaver pelts.
Very good, very good. We're going to talk about the fur trade. Unlike the English, who settled the New World looking for land, unlike the Spanish, who conquer the New World looking for gold, in the end, the French show up and are able to sustain their colony in New France because of their interest in the fur trade. From the mid-1600s, so let's just go ahead and say 1600s, to the 1760s, the colony of New France develops very slowly. Unlike the English, New France will constantly struggle with a low population. This is from a couple of different reasons. First and foremost is the area that the French settled generally is simply not as hospitable to widespread farming as the Chesapeake and certainly the middle colonies. What do we call this area that the French concentrate on? Modern Canada. This is the birth of Canada. Many of Canada's biggest cities, Quebec and Montreal, were born as French colonies. New France, after all, is the same expression as New York or New Amsterdam. It is a colony in the New World led by French officers, led by French colonials, and the one man who dominates this period of French history in a way that almost no monarch dominates any period of history is who? Who is the great monarch that leads France for these years?
Louis the 16th, 14th.
That one loses his head. This is the one we're looking for. Louis the 14th. What is Louis's famous nickname?
Sun King.
Damn, you guys are on it.
He was obsessed with the
No,
sun, wasn't
okay,
he?
so I have a teacher from high school, and he taught like almost every AP history class, so I had him every year, and he writes and sings his own parodies, and he has one called Can't Stop the Sun King.
Wow.
So Can't Stop the Feeling.
Wow. What, is this Louisville High School?
No, it's Henderson County.
Henderson County, okay. This sounds like a couple of high school teachers I've heard of. Yes, the Sun King. Louis the 14th, like you see there, the Grand Monarch. Louis the 14th.
The dude in heels.
What was that?
The dude in heels.
The dude in heels.
Of course, they were male fashion back then.
Yes, very much so. Big wigs, big clothes, big personality, big politician. Louis is very interesting just as a person. The man ruled for decade after decade. He came to age, back when I mentioned, if we go back a few slides and jump back to the age of the religious wars, you guys remember I mentioned briefly Cardinal Richelieu, who led France during these years. And what did I say Cardinal Richelieu's big goal was for the French?
A nation?
Yeah, centralization and the defeat of France's nobles. Very good. Richelieu and his successor, who I'm not going to ask you to memorize, Cardinal Mazarin, certainly accomplished this. In the end, we get back to Louis. Louis's participation in the French Civil Wars very much shapes his overall beliefs about what a king is. Remember those civil wars I mentioned briefly in France, the Fronde, in which France's nobles were essentially neutered, is a good way to think of it. By the time Louis is grown up, he is a man who is deeply touched by these civil wars. He feels in the end, the only way a king can rule a country is by himself. He is absolutely our definition of the absolute monarch. All government begins and ends with him.
So, at that time, most of like the officers and stuff would have been nobility, right?
Mm-hmm.
So who, like, did the king have to, beat the nobles?
That's a good question. I should be more specific. When I say that he neuters the French nobility, what he does is instead of being an independent military nobility who feel they can challenge him, they become a military nobility who belong to him. And so they will continue to serve, but now they're going to serve in his armies at his request, at his demand. Essentially, what he does is he trades out an independent and powerful military nobility for a dependent military nobility who need his favor, who need his ability to grant titles, and who need his ability to give them land. He very much co-opts them. In fact, he's so good at it, so institutionalizes this, that the French nobility literally fight to gain precedence in order to talk to him. And so he institutes several different royal, what we could call royal bedchamber positions, whose job it is, we're talking about the highest French nobility, whose job it is to put on his shoes, to bring him his chamber pot, to put on his jacket. When I clip his toenails, exactly.
Wow.
The very highest French military nobility literally kissing his feet is what we're talking about.
That's sad. Like, that's a sad life.
Is it? So what, if you have to debase yourself for 5 minutes to your king each day, if your king is handing out dukedoms and land and big military things? This is what he does. He very much brings them into his view of the government. This is a very different view of the government than the English, right? In which the nobility dominate the king. Now, the king dominates the nobility in France. Part of the reason that this rivalry lasts so long, the strategic rivalry between the English and the French, at least in this version of it, lasts from roughly the 1660s through 1789. Depending on how you define it, and military historians and political historians have tried to define it several times, there's 3 big eras of French and English fighting over the course of the 2 of them essentially being neighbors. Does anybody know what the 3 big periods of strategic rivalry are? Will you take a guess? The 100 Years' War, very good, is the first one. Lasting from the 1300s to the mid-1400s is the first big strategic fight between the French and the English. This is the second one. This one will be essentially colonial in aspect, much more global. We'll talk about a little bit about both, but the French and the English go to war many times during this period. And the last one, what's the last big fight? Napoleon, very good. The Napoleonic War is the last of the 3 big strategic wars between the French and the British, or at least the last in the 3rd period. After that, the French and the English eventually become what? Allies. We'll see in World War I and World War II. Long-term enemies become friends by the modern century, and they still are to this day. This is a time when the 2 empires are the 2 most important countries in the world. With Spain declining as it will by the late 1600s, early 1700s, it leads to the growth of France, the Kingdom of France, and the Kingdom of Britain. We'll talk about kind of the interplay between these 2. At the time, it's led by Louis, especially in the last few decades of the 1600s. The colonial project in the New World, though, is much, much smaller than it is for the English. In fact, like I mentioned, it will have a very hard time coming up with the population resources to build an empire on the same size as the English in the New World. To give you some perspective of this, in 1750, does anybody want to guess how many people lived in the 13 original colonies in 1750?
At least several million.
Not several, but you're in the right area. Say about 1.5 million. Anybody want to take a shot at New France at the same time?
300,000.
I was thinking, yeah, around the 100,000.
Try 60,000.
Oh,
A much smaller population. Though in the end, as you guys can see from this map, and then we'll look at the second map, the French Empire that they claim is very, very large. Take a look at the map as it changes from one slide to another.
Oh, shit, okay.
Now, as you might expect from the fact that I said the population is so small, this is not an area the French occupy with a significant population. Most of it for them is then what you might expect based on what I said about the fur trade. We're talking here about forts, trading posts, and land claims.
Mostly around the Mississippi River.
Very good. I was just about to mention this. Go back to the last slide on the French Canada. The French and Canada, when they set up their colonial enterprise, unlike the English, who generally base it upon, you remember when we talked about the little grid squares of expanding settlement?
Hub and spoke.
Very good. The French do it very differently. They look for and claim river headlands. What's a headland? It's where the river originates. Wherever the river originates, if the French find it, they claim the rest of what? Everything it touches. So, for instance, if you were to discover the Mississippi, what then would you be able to claim?
All the way to the
Everything.
The Mississippi watershed, which is exactly how they do it. For instance, the Ohio, the St. Lawrence, the biggest of their claims. All, what was that?
The Monongahela.
The Monongahela later. The Monongahela becomes an issue that we'll talk about, but it isn't one they claim specifically. The big ones, though, are the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi, which give them claim to a vast majority of the interior.
All the way to the Gulf.
Exactly.
So, like, their economic relations with the natives, plus like the fact that they weren't building like big settlements, is that why they were preferable?
Ding, ding, ding. You've hit on a very important point. Given that much of the area they claim is never occupied by them, it means they're going to rely on what?
The natives.
Native alliances. Unlike the English, who see the natives as what?
Enemies.
Enemies, or at the very least impediments, the French see them as a potential source of what? Alliances. Now, let's be clear. If the French had had the same demographic or military power that the English or Spanish had, would they have treated the natives the same way?
Probably, yeah.
As the English and Spanish? Absolutely. They would not have treated them this way if they could simply have overpowered them. They couldn't. They never had the population resources. Ergo, they had to rely on natives for a variety of reasons. Now, part of the reason they're able to do this is they're much better at integrating French power with native culture. Unlike the English and the Spanish, the French are more than willing to assimilate both individually and culturally with the natives. The same reason that the Jesuits, who end up being the major conversion force, excuse me, I say Jesuits? Yes. Who end up being the major conversion force of the French Empire, often marry into native tribes. The French are very willing to not only marry and have children, but adopt themselves into native tribes and vice versa. There is a much more symbiotic relationship between the French and the natives than either of the other two empires, for the simple reason they do not have the power to say you have to do this. It's much more about cooperation. Now, they find out very quickly that the best way to keep and maintain these native alliances is via a system we call gift giving. In native culture, giving gifts was very, very important in the maintenance of alliances. In particular, what gift above all others was favored?
Gun.
guns, exactly. The French have none of the compunction that the English have about arming their allies and even occasionally their enemies if need be, in order to maintain the fur trade. The fur trade is predicated on the fact at the same time back in Europe, there is a massive boom in terms of the need of beaver pelts, generally for what fashion item? Ladies' hats. They are worth their weight in gold, quite a bit beyond that, in fact. The Frenchmen who served in this fur trading empire very quickly adapt themselves to a very harsh new world. We call them, generally, the coureurs. Oh man, this is gonna be
And
bad.
this is the people who went over there?
Yes, these are, coureurs de bois, wood runners. These are the French tradesmen who travel deep into the interior, claiming land for France, trading with allied tribes or tribes they had not met before, and basically bringing France deeper and deeper into the interior.
Is it Coureur de Bois?
Coureurs de bois, wood runners, essentially, is the French translation. These wood runners, you guys can see from a couple of these pictures, are very, very much willing to adapt themselves to native clothing, native alliances, and native ways of life in an effort to make sure that the trade continues. Even though these men will eventually make up the vast majority of French explorers, in the end, France organizes its colony the exact same way the English do, except for the fact that their colonies are much more
Vulnerable?
centralized. Remember, the English project, because of the different ways the 13 colonies develop or the Caribbean colonies develop, are often very much divided and at different purposes. That just simply does not happen on the French side because they are all managed through the same bureau back in France that controls essentially all of their colonial projects. Now, as you might expect, in the end, that's going to help them fight their wars, right? They're more organized. They're certainly more centralized. Their big disadvantage is what, though? Manpower. In the end, they simply will find when they fight the English that there's just not enough of them. And in the end, the French will lose their big ability to reinforce the New World. We'll talk about that later. We have to understand that at the time, even in the 1600s, specifically by the 1670s and 80s, there are a bunch of wars going on in Europe. So let's talk about that. This is a central point I need you guys to get down. So star it, circle it, whatever you need to do. Generally, at the time, wars in Europe impacted the colonies, not the other way around. What does this mean?
There was like a skirmish on a colony that wouldn't have like rippling effects to Europe.
Very good. Simple as that. The Europeans, and as I just mentioned, the French and English were at war pretty much regularly from the 1600s through the mid-1700s, are at war almost constantly. Did their colonists know about these wars?
Maybe, yeah.
Always, always. News traveled. Even if it was slow, it would get to the New World. Did the colonists eventually and sometimes take up arms in support of the government at home?
Sure,
Yeah. Did they go back to Europe to fight them?
No.
No. They served in campaigns close to them. In the end, as you guys will see here, and we'll talk about some of these wars in particular, the most famous, at least early, is the War of Spanish Succession. That's the only one I'm going to ask you guys to memorize. This one originates in Europe, as most of these do. Certainly the War of King Jenkins' Ear, Queen Anne's War, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Polish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession. There's a lot of these wars. Please don't think you need to put them all in your brain.
Wasn't World War II technically the War of German Succession?
No,
No?
no. We would call the wars of German unification in the 1870s, something like that, but
Okay.
not by World War II. It's a good question.
Okay, I thought, since they were expanding.
They certainly were, but they, when I say, that's a good question. Let me make this clear. When I say succession, and the reason a lot of these European wars are called wars of certain succession, Spanish, Polish, Austrian, or the three big wars of succession. What does that mean?
There's not a heir to the throne.
Either there's not an heir, or there's an heir that somebody is contesting. Because remember, all these royals have a whole bunch of very confused bloodlines, and frequently will use these dynastic problems as what?
Excuse to further war.
That's it. That's all it is. Most of these are excuses to fight a war. The War of Spanish Succession is the most important because, as like we've said, Spain is what at the time? Declining, but it's also still big. This is now 100, 200 years since the first time Cortez stepped foot in the New World. Spain's empire is gigantic. Spain, however, has a very, very big problem. Its king is dying. Anybody know which king I'm talking about in 1700 who passes right on at 1700? One of the saddest stories in European history. This is King Carlos II. Anybody know what was wrong with him? Everything. He was the product of many, many years of Habsburg inbreeding. Even when he was born, most European observers assumed he would die almost immediately. He had the Habsburg jaw. He drooled uncontrollably. His sex organs did not work, despite the number of times they tried to get women to marry him. He stank constantly because he refused to bathe. At one point, he may have gone 2 or 3 years without a bath. He was almost certainly mentally unbalanced. And yet, despite every European in the entirety of Western Europe wondering when he was going to die, he kept on ticking until his 30s. Shocked the whole world. But as the king of Spain, he had to produce an heir. In the end, given all of these maladies, he was not able to. In fact, when they did a dissection of him after he passed away, he was missing several vital organs. Several of his organs were also just blackened.
There's something about peppercorn or something like that, like something the size of a peppercorn.
Yes, I can't remember which of his organs.
Full of water or something.
Yeah,
like
the guy was basically a ticking time bomb because of the number. His mother and father were first cousins.
He was flat, pretty much.
Within a Habsburg family that for several hundred years had been practicing pretty regular inbreeding. What that meant was, for Carlos, if he died without an heir, what would happen to the Spanish Empire?
It would collapse.
It would collapse, or it would be ripped apart into different pieces by lots of competing empires. Exactly. So Carlos II, on his deathbed, made a choice to give his throne to whom? A French prince of the blood, one of Louis's many, many grandchildren. And in doing so, who objected? Everybody did, basically. The Spanish Empire was too big. And if Louis put one of his grandchildren on the throne of Spain, what would that have done for France?
It would empower France.
It would have made it invincible. To combine France's growing military power with Spain's resources in the New World would have made Louis the universal monarch he wanted to be, which is why he tried so hard to make it happen, which is why we get the War of Spanish Succession. In the end, it is the Spanish who have a succession problem, but it's all of Europe who get dragged in. The war lasts about 15 years, and it's one of those that if you study it is a fascinating war. I'm not going to dig too deep, because in the end, what really matters is what happens in the New World. Europe, lots and lots of places are traded. You guys don't need to memorize them. One commander in particular emerges on the British side, somebody that we would generally see as one of the great commanders in military history. This is the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill. In fact, as an interesting quirk of the historical timeline, does anybody know who John Churchill's great-great-great-great-grandnephew was? Winston.
Churchill.
Yep, he was born at the house that the British government built for John Churchill for his victories in this war. John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, won 4 big battles. He won Blenheim, Oudenarde, Ramillies, and Malplaquet. And in doing so, he turned himself into a national hero. So they built him a house, Blenheim Palace, where many years later, one of his descendants' kids, Winston Churchill, a Spencer, just like him, was born. There's your weird quirk of
So,
fate.
wait, would that mean that Winston Churchill and Princess Diana were related? I mean, she was a
She is Spencer. Yeah, she's a Spencer. I don't think she's a Spencer of that So let me say this. Winston is a cadet branch of this family. It's not a direct thing. It's off to the side somewhere, and I can't remember where Diana is on that line, but she does come from the English line too, somewhere. I don't remember.
So what year would this have got been, that the thing was built?
His house is built in the 1710s, and will continue to be built until the 1720s. If anybody's ever visited it, it's massive. It's a gorgeous building, but it's not really a house. It's more of a shrine to the commander. So at the time, if you did a good job as a military noble, they built you houses. It's a nice way to live. So, the point of saying all this, there's a long runaround, is in the end, the war is decided entirely where? In Europe. It's decided, the war is fought almost entirely in Europe. And in the end, once things are done, once the Europeans have had enough bloodletting, what do they say about the New World?
Time to take your fighting there.
No need to. They trade some pieces of territory. This is something we'll see again and again. Most of these wars in Europe means that territory is traded as part of settlements, i.e., whenever the treaty is signed that says the war is over, there's been a bargaining table, quite literally, where French and English diplomats got together and say, you get this, you get that, you get this, you get that. It always depended on, obviously, how the war went. Now, this war was very long and very destructive, but by comparison, it was not nearly as destructive and not nearly as widespread as other later wars we'll talk about. And so the lands exchanged generally does not impact the New World very much. Any campaigns fought in the New World are much smaller in scale. Make sense? Christian.
So this is just like an continuation of the feudal system that they, like where they would trade land.
Yes, let's call it what it is though. Instead of it being about feudal land nobles getting their own land within the context of a nation, this is now a nation state building its own territory. Eventually, the lines that are drawn in this 100 years will be eventually the borders we now know today in a lot of places. Before that, it's much more about the nobility enhancing their own land. Now, the nobles are enhancing the land of who? The king. Now they've been co-opted into the king's system, essentially. And so they're still fighting, they're still gaining things, but generally a noble who's fighting now is not getting territory, he's getting what? Titles. He's getting houses built for him. He's getting things at the behest of the king as opposed to fighting for himself and getting land for himself. Make sense? So you're right. Where we are now is in a weird transitory period between the old feudal wars and the modern national wars. Let's talk about what this period is called. We generally call these wars cabinet wars. Why? Anybody got a guess? When I mean cabinet here, do I mean like the cabinet in your house that holds your dishware? What do I mean?
Like a close, appointed group, yeah.
Like a president's cabinet, right? Or in this case, a king's cabinet. When these are called cabinet wars because they're decided, led, and prosecuted by a small minority of government officials. They often did, harness the population and power of the country, but nobody has a say in it outside of these groups. Make sense? Just because the average person is getting dragged into the army doesn't mean they have any connection to or feeling for these wars. These are not national wars with nationalism. These are about the men who run these countries and the enrichment of those countries. In fact, Louis XIV was very, very clear about why he fought his wars. Does anybody know what his biggest goal was other than territorial aggrandizement? La gloire. He believed that by taking territory, he enhanced his what? His personal prestige. He didn't mind if 10,000 or 20,000 French soldiers died as long as it made him look like what? A greater monarch. That's not a war of the people. That's a war of the king fought by the people. Make sense?
Pretty much.
It's tough. This is a very tough period. So ask questions if you're not seeing the difference here. We're going to get into the people's wars. What spurs the birth of national people's wars? Well, we'll get there. What do you think that is? the Revolutionary Wars. First the American, and more importantly, the French. Wars in which the people themselves aren't just fighting, but have a vested interest in the outcome. They do not in these wars. If a peasant fights in this war, do they get anything? No. If a peasant fights in the revolution, might he get something? Yes. So that's a big difference. We'll get to that later. These are kings fighting with little armies on a battlefield. Think about it that way, okay? Very much
Pretty
risk.
much kids squabbling.
Yeah, for a lot of reasons, it's a good point. So let's talk about the international dimensions that drive these contests. In the end, despite Louis and other monarchs thinking it was largely about them, we can't divorce these from their strategic implications. Most importantly is the growing context of mercantilism. Anybody know what mercantilism is?
Business, right?
It's like the colonial international economic system where the colonies produce all the raw merchandise and they exist solely for the betterment of the home country.
Ding, ding, ding. It's the economic system that binds colony to home country. This relationship is entirely one-sided, as you might expect. The raw materials produced in these colonies are supposed to be solely for who? The home country. Britain has specific navigational laws on its books that say Virginia can only sell its tobacco to who? England. That's it.
Like the Navigation Act.
Exactly. These acts make sure that the home country is bound to their colonies and the colonies are bound to the home countries. At the time, Adam Smith and other early economists, I'll get the word out, early economists believed that that was the best way for a country to develop, was by a closed system. Now Adam Smith would expand on this, a closed system that tied these countries to each other, but did not allow for foreign interference. What would we call if a Virginia planter sold his tobacco to a French island of the Caribbean? That would be called smuggling. Treason is a little bit high. Smuggling is much more a better way to think about it. And to be fair, the British authorities generally were okay with smuggling on the down low because they were still able to, more often than not, collect either taxes or revenue on it if they could find it. Now, what's important to understand here is that at the same time these mercantilist principles are growing, so are the colonies themselves. It's better that we understand that this is beginning to go global in scope. It's not just the colonies in the New World that are growing. Where else are Britain and France also starting to put down roots and poke at each other?
Africa.
Not Africa.
Caribbean.
They're definitely in the Caribbean.
Asia?
Where specifically?
India.
India. India has become a big, another place that they're competing with one another. Again, what we kind of see is where the French go, so do the British. Where the British go, so do the French.
Where does China play a huge player in all this?
China becomes a big piece of the imperial game by the 1840s and 50s. We'll get to the open door policy probably next class, maybe next semester. But generally, China becomes a real big deal once it starts collapsing in and on of itself in the late 1800s.
How are they getting to India?
A long-ass boat ride, frankly.
So was it like the southern part of
Southern
India?
tip of Africa.
They follow the southern tip of Africa and then sail up interestingly enough, despite the fact that they were sailing from Britain around Africa, most of the settlements of both the French and the English are on the eastern side of India. The French at Pondicherry and the English in Bengal. And so what they called these were essentially trading stations. They were not yet acquiring big territories in India. What they were trying to acquire was the ability to trade with the Indian princes. And India was extremely wealthy. So what you're generally seeing is, even though we're only looking at a piece of it, the one that will impact the United States eventually, it's very much a global competition. And that's the underpinning of all of it, is this competition, both in Europe and in the New World and in Asia and in Africa. The French take Gorée, which is an eastern or western African island, the same era. They're competing everywhere. Some of it is via trade. Eventually, it'll become military in scope. But remember, these are men, generally the military nobility of these countries, who know each other and have fought with each other across the European wars. It's important we understand that, because despite the vast gulf that we tend to think of between the French and the English, more often than not, they are still, the military nobility still belongs to the same class structure that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. These are nobles whose job it is and their responsibility to the government is either to serve as a soldier in the government or to serve as a politician in the government at the behest of their ruler. In fact, the French are so clear about it, they actually divide all their nobles into two different groups. Anybody know what they were called? The noblesse des sang and the noblesse des robes. You guys want to try and...
The first one is noble by blood. So
Nobles of the blood.
Of the blood. So I'm guessing it's somebody born into the nobility.
It's also the military nobility. Blood means a couple things there, you're right. And noblesse des robes,
Priestess?
judges,
The judge.
civil authority, very good. Most of these groups were divided the same way, maybe not so explicitly in England, but if you were a noble, your job was to do what? Serve somewhere. That's the whole point of it. We'll talk about the average commoner later. That's a very different story. These wars are going to be led by the same man over and over again. Now, I want you to take a look at this map and tell me a little bit about this map, because this map is going to really, really impact us. So if you're looking at home, we're now on mercantilism and international warfare. Take a look at this map and tell me what you see.
A lot of competing powers here.
Ignore the Spanish. Remember what I said, the Spanish are slowly but surely falling apart. They will come back into our story pretty much not again.
I got a donut hole in the middle that somebody's gonna fight for.
This?
Yeah.
Why is this donut hole?
Because it's unclaimed.
It's unclaimed as of yet. Does anybody know who lives here?
Natives?
Yeah, what natives? Anybody want to take a shot? Close. Close.
Choctaw?
Creek. This is the Creek area. Will eventually become the Cherokee as well, and the Seminole will grow out of these groups, but it's the Creek. We'll talk about the Creeks later. Concentrate here.
Yeah, so they can expand any further.
What's happening?
Landlocked.
The claims of both the French and the English are slowly but surely running into one another.
Yeah.
This is going to be, as you might expect, in this context, a big, big problem. Now, this is not a quick process. In fact, in particular, this process has really been occurring only over the last 50 years, in which the backcountry, the frontier of both of these powers is slowly but surely running into one another. As you might expect, given what we talked about in this class about the English and French colonial patterns, does that French blue look a little bit too big for its britches?
Yeah.
Why do you think that? Why would you assume that?
So we were just talking about how they were low in numbers.
So there's like 60,000 people.
Very, very, very sparse on the ground. In fact, the way the French claim land, this will probably make you crack up, is French expeditions generally traveled these rivers with lead plates that said this land is claimed for France. And so French lieutenants who led these expeditions, when they got to the headwaters of particularly large rivers, dug a hole, dropped the plate in that said, I claim this land for the King of France, and moved on. Marked it on their maps, and that was the way in which they controlled it. So this is a big-ass blue area, right? Where are the French on it? Almost entirely along the St. Lawrence corridor, right here. A tiny, tiny colony claiming huge areas.
That's like having 100-room house and only using one.
That's exactly it. But why would the French do it that way?
Prestige.
Prestige is a huge part of it. Very good. This is a lot of land to be able to put on a map, right? Back in France, if this is hanging up in front of, say, Louis' wall, look at all that land we own. Look at all that land we've claimed.
It's visible from space.
It's a big-ass chunk of territory, right? I mean, this is bigger in the end than about the entirety of the Louisiana Purchase later. It's a big area. What else do the French think about this area? Do they always think they'll be so sparse on the ground? They hope eventually, if not to have the same demographics as the English, but eventually to be able to change this from territory they claim to territory they actually occupy. So some of it is long-term planning. And probably most importantly is what? Consider it within the strategic rivalry with the English.
We have more than the English.
If we claim it,
It was strange then.
they can't.
It limits-
That's it. The goal here in the end, and the French were very clear and the English were very afraid of it, was that eventually they'll simply stop the English from growing further west. They're just as concerned about English growth as the natives are. And this is why in the end the French and natives will find natural allies against the English during this next war.
So could the English settlers see that like, hey, over here is fucking India, can we just roll on through?
In the end, the French and Indian War happens because of the modern territory that we call Ohio, in which the English see a big, open, and available piece of land. The French look at it and say the same thing. And so, in the end, it'll be a French expedition running into a British expedition in the backcountry that sparks the worst war in human history to that point.
Over Ohio?
Over Ohio. Of all the places, it's Ohio that sets off the French and Indian War. Simply because Ohio is what?
Big and empty.
Not big and empty. It's just where the two pieces connect. And what is Ohio? What river does Ohio have that empties down eventually into the Ohio? The Monongahela is another one
Pittsburgh.
of these headwaters. Pittsburgh, or Fort Pitt, named for the for the English Prime Minister, is one of these flashpoint spots. We'll talk about it, but in the end, the reason for this war is it's where two colonial borders run into each other. But, big but here, what did I just say about how these wars go? Europe to the New World, or the New World to Europe?
Goes from Europe to the New World conflict.
Always Europe to the New World. Always Europe to the New World. Until we get to the French and Indian War. The one war that flips it on its head, in which colonial claims are finally more important than European claims. Why would this be? Last big thought for the day. Think about it in this system. Why would, after nearly 80 years of side-by-side growth with only small conflicts, why all of a sudden would the English and French government say, Ohio, of all places, is worth a world war?
They rely on colonies more.
Take that step further.
He's got a feed the machine. It's a big.
Keep taking it. You both are you're exactly on the right track.
Where they're getting all their money from.
Keep going. What's the fear of both sides of this? Before this point, Europe is the central context for these wars. They all start in Europe. The War of Spanish Succession, Queen Anne's War, the War of Jenkins' Ear. All of these wars start in Europe and then sometimes spill into the colonies. This one doesn't just spill from the colonies into Europe. It engulfs the entirety of Europe and all of its colonies in a massive war. Why the hell would the French and English, after nearly 80 years of only concentrating on Europe, suddenly say, Ohio is worth the world?
Great question.
It is a great question. I deeply agree.
They don't want the other empire to get those resources.
Pretty much. By this point, both sides are beginning to realize that the mercantilist system requires these colonies to continue to grow, to work, especially which of these two countries? England. The fast-growing demographics that we talked about, the part that outnumbers the French so clearly, means the English are beginning to feel a little bit penned up on the eastern seaboard.
Almost like you're saying the indentured servants get free and they got so much to go.
They've got to keep going.
They gotta keep moving.
What is this big old thing that marks this border?
Appalachian.
The Appalachians. The English have hit a natural geographic block. And the next step would mean that they are very consciously doing what?
Crossing.
They're crossing an area that seems like a very clear geographical boundary. And the French see it the same way. Ohio isn't just Ohio, it's what?
West of the Appalachians.
It's the whole game. And so in the end, the reason that this war sparks in such a faraway backwoods, and let's be clear, the French court and the English court both have an opportunity at the outbreak of this war to say no. They both are given a very clear chance, and we'll talk about why, to say it's not worth it. Ohio is not worth it. And both courts decide in the end what? It's totally worth it. They don't get there, and they certainly wouldn't have gotten there before this if they hadn't come to realize that the constant acquisition of land was a struggle in the end for life and death for these empires. We know who wins because it produces the United States. But at the time, the idea that France would have occupied most of the New World was certainly on the English mind. They were afraid of it. They feared containment. And more to the point, they feared eventually expulsion. The chances of that were nil. But it's exactly how they talked about it at the cabinet level. And so when we come back on Wednesday, we're going to talk about a young Virginian aristocrat who had a hand in exploring the Ohio country and why his mistakes touch off a world war. I'll see you on Wednesday.
Yeah, the French and Indian War is technically the First World War.
Exactly.
Yeah. You know, if you think about it.
It's my favorite war to study.